When Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal those who were ill. He told them, "Take nothing for the journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirt. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, leave their town and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them." So they set out and went from village to village, proclaiming the good news and healing people everywhere.
Well, I read recently an amazing story. I've been reading a book about prayer by a chap called Tyler. And when Tyler was 13 years old, he was rather skeptical about how God worked. But he had a minuscule amount of faith. And so a mentor challenged him one summer to prayer walk around his school and see if anything would change. So he decided to take up this challenge. He had an older brother who just passed his driving test. The older brother was very happy to drive every morning and take him to the school to walk around. And Tyler had a list of all the children that were in his year group. So every day in that summer holiday, he circled the school, praying for those children. And when the new term started in September, his heart was on fire for Jesus and for his friends, and he longed for them to come to know that same love. And so he went into the headmaster's office. He'd not darkened those doors before, but he boldly went in and said, "I want to start an extracurricular meeting for my friends to learn about Jesus." And there were a few barriers he needed to overcome. But needless to say, a meeting was started. By the way, at 6:30 in the morning, not the best time, I don't think, to invite teenagers, but a meeting was started. And lo and behold, over the course of that first term, many of his friends came to know Jesus. And they soon outgrew that classroom and had to find another venue that was big enough for all of his friends. I love that story. That boy's desire grew over that summer. He fell in love with Jesus and his friends. And how amazing to have that opportunity and the school to bless that and for that meeting to grow and grow and grow. So my question for us today as we think about sharing God's love is, what's our heart's desire? What's your heart's desire for your friends, your family, and your neighbors? In Romans chapter 10, Paul writes, "Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire is that you may be saved." Very simple, that you may be saved, that you may know the freedom that Jesus brings, that you may know freedom from all that holds you and traps you, that you may know that life-transforming love of Jesus. And Paul goes on a little bit later in that same chapter, in verse 14, he writes, "How can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them?" Paul's very clear. Proclaim the good news. So let me ask you that question again. What is your heart's desire for your friends, your neighbors, and your family? You see, there's nothing wrong with saying, just less stress, better work-life balance, less conflict, fairer wages for all, an end to homelessness. But deep down, if we're sitting here today following Jesus, even if we need reminding week by week, day by day, even if we've got doubts and questions, Jesus is the only one who will offer true peace, a real hope, he's one that will never leave you. He's one that will stick by you. He promises that. And if you don't know that, I hope you've heard something about that already today, and you'll continue to hear more about Jesus. And guess what? Those of us that follow Jesus, someone had to explain that to us. And on this Mothering Sunday, yes, it's a moment where we remember our mothers, but I wonder if you want to take a moment now just to think about perhaps those spiritual people, maybe spiritual women, who have told you about Jesus. I'll be forever grateful to a lady called Helen, who summer by summer taught me about Jesus at a Christian camp. I will be forever grateful to Ali, Kaz, Nat, and Jules, who are my friends at university. In those heady days where it's quite challenging to be a Christian, they took me to the CU week after week. And I'll be forever grateful to my godmother, Mandy, who faithfully prays for me. She says Thursday is her godchildren day, so I know I get prayed for weekly. And in all honesty, if it wasn't for these women, I don't know if I'd be standing here today. Who are you grateful for that's talked to you, spoken to you about Jesus? That's what we're thinking about today. There's loads of ways I know that we at Christ Church and a community share Jesus' love. We show it in so many ways. I'm not going to list all the activities, but you will know, you will have heard some of them. But how do we speak about Jesus? We're told in Matthew's Gospel, those famous words right at the end. It says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations." And you might be tempted to think, really, that's not for me. Well, I was challenged by these words. Theologian Rebecca Manley-Pipperet wrote, Jesus did not say, "Go therefore, all you extroverts, all you with dynamic communication skills and all those gifted as evangelists, and make disciples. The rest of you just hang out, sing some hymns and wait till I return." No, Jesus is asking every Christian from every land, culture, whatever gifts or personality type, to be those that share his good news. Don't let this command feel heavy and burdensome, because I truly believe, just like Tyler over that summer, that as you fall in love with Jesus again, as you remind yourself of his amazing sacrifice, what he's done for you, that will just bubble up and you will overflow with his love. You won't be able to help but speak about the difference that he's made in your life. And this passage we read in Luke, it records these early moments when the disciples are sent out under Jesus' instruction. To date, they've just been observers, they've just been watching, but now they become the doers. And in this passage, I just want to highlight two helpful pointers as we think about how do we share Jesus' love. The first one might sound obvious, but it's important. So firstly, speak about Jesus. Now, I reckon there's some debate, certainly Google tells me there's some debate about what personality type Jesus was. You can come to your own conclusions. But one thing we do know is that Jesus was very focused. He had a mission in life, and he didn't get sidetracked from it. And he's really clear to his 12. When he sends them out, they've got a specific job. In verse 2, to proclaim the kingdom of God. And then again, the agenda is confirmed in verse 6. They're set out to proclaim the good news. They're to speak about Jesus. Yes, they've also been given, we read, authority and power to cast out demons and to heal. But this is done to serve to draw people to Jesus, that through those amazing signs of wonders, they would know who Jesus is. It is, if you like, to authenticate his message. So the priority is clear. Proclaim the good news. And proclaim means to publicly declare, to speak it out. I wonder if you've ever had that question on a Monday, perhaps, whether at the shops or in the office or at the school gate, where someone asks, "What did you do at the weekend?" And everyone shares their tales, and then it's left to you. What are you going to say? Well, personally, I feel quite comfortable saying that I went to church. Some people might know my job, so I'm okay doing that. But actually speaking about the detail, speaking about Jesus, speaking about something that I've heard that's made a difference in my life, well, that sometimes feels a little bit trickier. And I love this quote. Mark Green wrote a fantastic book called Fruitfulness on the Front Line. And he writes, sharing the good news can feel a little bit like a visit to the dentist. We know we're meant to go, and when we get there, we know we're meant to open our mouths. But we're rather afraid that when we do, extremely unpleasant and painful things will happen to us. Is that true? I hate the dentist. I like the dentist, just not going. But why is that? Why is it hard to speak about Jesus if he's really made this difference in our life? There'll be all sorts of different reasons. We're all different people here today. But perhaps for some of us, it might be that we've got a false view about what everyday sharing about Jesus looks like. We might feel like we're going to get tripped up by tough questions. We haven't read enough. We haven't known Jesus for long enough. Simply just don't know what to say. Well, in a report recently written called Talking Jesus, this is a report by a load of parachurch organizations that look at how we share faith. The stats are in, and they show that 75% of non-Christians felt comfortable having a conversation about the Christian faith with their Christian friends. That's encouraging, isn't it? 75%. So we perhaps don't need to have anxiety in the same way. That's quite a lot of people that would be really happy to have a conversation. Slightly more challengingly in this report, they found that 42% of Christians said they didn't know their non-Christians well enough to share their faith. And that's why actually at Christ Church, one of the things we love to do is to seek to get to know our community, to seek to get to know those around us. As we do things like Go Forth Sunday, and we go out into our communities and we bless those around us, longing to speak about him, longing that they might know the goodness of God. And I loved at our recent prayer and worship evening, Ryan shared a prayer request for all that happens at St. Barnabas and the Hub. And it was simple. He said, we often just sit and eat and chat. He said, while we do that, I'd love you to pray, just like Paul prays in Colossians, that their conversation would always be full of grace and seasoned with salt. In those everyday conversations, the message of Jesus would be heard. And by the way, when we think about these disciples, when we think about them being sent out on this occasion, they were hardly trained. They weren't equipped with gospel tracts. They hadn't sat and listened to sermons or read books. They were probably just as skeptical, maybe full of the same questions and doubts that we have today. If we just looked back to Luke chapter 8, we read that Jesus calmed the storm. And they're sat in that boat quaking at the end going, who is this man? And yet Jesus gives them the authority and the power to go out and speak the good news. That's the first thing that I want to help us to think about, to speak about Jesus. The second thing is to be God confident. Jesus instructs them in verse 3, take nothing for the journey. No staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirts. That's a curious list, isn't it? Well, when I get ready for a trip, I don't know about you, but definitely a few days before, I lay out my clothes, pack extra pants, get everything ready, all the chargers, all the necessary bits. I definitely don't, I try to take as big a bag as possible. Plan for every eventuality. It's Britain, isn't it? We never know what the weather's going to be like. But Jesus says, take nothing. By the way, that's not actually a principle that he holds to. And if we were to read a little bit later on in Luke chapter 22, he tells us that they can take a staff and a purse and a bag. But I think there's a specific purpose here right at the beginning, as they are sent out, these disciples, he wants them to learn to be God confident, not self-confident. He wants them to learn to trust that he will provide for all of their needs as they step out in faith and expectation. And I believe it's the same for us. Jesus wants us not to worry and be anxious about stuff, about things that we might get wrapped up in, things that might block our vision and our intentionality to share Jesus. Being God confident doesn't mean having all the answers. It doesn't mean having read all the books. Being God confident means remembering that we all hold his story, some of his story, and that you have a story too of how Jesus has been at work in your life. And actually that is all that witnessing and speaking about Jesus is. It's about connecting God's story, his love, with our story and helping our friends to see how their story connects with God's story. Ultimately, God confidence means trusting him with the resources and the results. We do our bit, God does his bit in his time. And actually, timing is an interesting thing. If we were to look at verse 5, it says, this is Jesus' instructions to the disciples, if people do not welcome you, leave their town. There's a sense of urgency there to get the message out. This is his work. We're to move on. We're to go to those that are ready and receptive to hear Jesus. We're to be guided by his Holy Spirit and trust that he's at work. I heard this story. It's on one of the Alpha videos. You may have heard it before, about a chap called Albert McAlpin, a 24-year-old farmer. And he's having a hard time trusting God with one of his friends. He was desperate for them to come to know Jesus. And Albert had recently come to faith, and he decided that each week he was going to fill a van and drive his friends to a meeting where they could hear about the good news. But his friend, a younger man, well, he was really hard to persuade. He wouldn't come. He was actually too busy with girls. He was too busy falling in and out of love with girls. But Albert decided to pray. And eventually, he was inspired by the Holy Spirit to invite this young man to be the driver of the van, which sounds quite inspired. And he agreed. He agreed to drive the van. That was all he was doing. But after a while, this young man thought, I'm going to go into that meeting. And he went in. He was utterly spellbound. And he went in week after week. And before long, he gave his life to Jesus. And the driver of the van, that man, that was Billy Graham, the international evangelist, sharing the good news on a worldwide scale. And he was only able to come to know Jesus because Albert had decided that he was just going to pray. He wasn't going to give up. He was going to pray. And he was inspired by God. And the rest, of course, is history. It's not always easy, is it, to speak about Jesus, to rely on him. But I've got a mnemonic to help us as we think about this. Pisa, because Pisa is the leaning tower. We're going to lean and trust on God, okay? Is that okay? Got that? And we need that. We need to lean and trust on God. So here are a few things. We've mentioned some of them, but just as a way of concluding, these are things that will just help us to share Jesus. Firstly, pray. Pray like Tyler did, even in your skepticism and doubt. Pray that your heart will be warmed again to know Jesus. And then pray out of that overflow for your friends, for your family members. Who is it that you go to? Jesus sent his disciples out to the villages. Well, where do you get sent? The gym, I don't know, the pub, your offices, your workplaces, your schools. Where are you going each day? And maybe also those unknown divine appointments, those random conversations that you might have on a bus or waiting in a queue somewhere. And pray too for organisations like Cross Teach, who are doing an amazing job of proclaiming the good news. So pray. Secondly, invite. One of the easiest ways, if you're feeling very nervous about what to say, invite someone, maybe to come to church or one of the events, that they can come to know Jesus, just like Albert did there, bringing his friend to know Jesus. Thirdly, story. We've all got a story. We might not share our whole story with our friend, they might get a little bit bored, but there might be something, somewhere, somehow, where Jesus has really answered a prayer or made a difference. You could ask yourself, what has the Lord done for me this week, this month, this year? And share that with your friends. They want to hear your stories. They want to know the personal difference that Jesus makes. And I truly believe that as you fall in love with Jesus more, that will just overflow. It won't feel like work. You will have stories to tell of the difference that Jesus has made. And lastly, ask. Ask your friend, what do they think? Help them to make that connection between God's story and their story. And when you're asking, they're going to tell you where they're at, and you're going to be better able to pray for them. So Pisa, pray, invite, story, and ask. A simple mnemonic to help us think through the challenge of sharing our faith. Well, I've spoken a lot. There may be many things that are going through your minds. And we're going to just listen and watch a song that speaks about the difference that Jesus makes. And while we listen to this song, I'd love you to just take this moment, this space, to pray. Pray for yourselves. You know, if you don't know Jesus personally yourself, pray that he might show himself. As you look at these words, you'll see the difference that he makes. Pray and ask God, where are you sending me? It may be just the ordinary routine that you go through, but there may be other people and places on your street or within, the school gate that the Lord wants to draw you to, that you've got a story and a message that could be shared with others. And maybe we want to pray for courage, because it's not easy, but the Lord will give us the strength. So if we have this song now, we're going to have just a moment to pray.